Good morning. I'd like to call this voting meeting of the House Finance Committee to order. And I'd like to start by having our senior committee legislative assistant, Lori Smith, call the roll.
Chairman Samuelson,
Here.
Rep. Abney,
Vote by designation.
Sapita Freites,
Vote by designation.
Tina Davis,
Vote by designation.
Fleming,
Vote by designation.
Gallagher, Gungauer, Harris, Krajewski,
Vote by designation.
Rabb,
Vote by designation.
Scott,
Vote by designation.
Vincant,
Vote by designation.
Waxman,
Vote by designation.
Webster.
And vote by designation.
Chairman Griner,
Here.
DeVanzo,
Vote by designation.
Fritz, Gatos,
Vote by designation.
Jones,
Vote by designation.
Kephart, Kutz, Mako, Rossi, Rinkavich,
Yeah, vote by designation.
Stamba,
Vote by designation.
Stender. Wow.
All members accounted for, and I should mention there's 8 other committee meetings going on in the Capitol this morning, so some of our members may be coming in the course of our meeting. I'd like to, we have 2 items on the agenda today, House Bill 2090 and House Bill 788. The chair calls up House Bill 2090, printer's number 2827. And I'd like to ask our Senior Committee Executive Director, Mark Foreman, to read a summary of the bill.
House Bill 2090 would prohibit the collection of interchange fees on the sales tax portion of a retail transaction.
And the question is, will the committee report the bill? I'd like to start by having some testimony, and we will begin with remarks by the prime sponsor of the bill. I'm a co-prime, and so is Representative Scott, but the prime sponsor of the bill is Representative Pat Gallagher out of Philadelphia. Representative Gallagher.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank the chairman and the committee for bringing this bill to our attention.
Is your microphone on?
Yeah, here we go. I want to thank the chair and the committee for bringing this bill up for a hearing. As a small business owner, you know, one of these things we do, we're reliant on these structures, and you know, everything in a small business is accounted for. We're down to the pennies, and I remember pinching pennies in my business, and these pennies add up in a long time. So if anywhere we can help small business and consumers save a little bit more money and running their business and running their finances, this is a good bill to start there. So thank you, Chair, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Representative Gallagher. And we had a similar bill in June of 2024. We had a public hearing on that bill in December of 2023. We shared the testimony from that public hearing. We have testimony this morning, and I'm very pleased that we have Deb Peters, an expert consultant from the Electronic Payments Coalition, and also Dan Swanson, an attorney and consultant from the Merchants Payments Coalition. And so I'd like to give each an opportunity. I know they provided written testimony to the members, and that's been distributed, and also it's in the packets this morning. But I'd like to call up first Deb Peters from the Electronic Payments Coalition. And also I'd like to note for the record that Representative Sapita Freites and Representative Webster are present.
Well, good morning. I don't know, is it working?
Yeah, you got to get closer.
Okay,
The green
I have
light.
to eat the mic. Okay. Oh, goodness. Heaven forbid for all of you. I apologize. So you've all gotten the written thing, but I just want to wish you all good morning. My name is Deb Peters. I'm a certified public accountant and recovering state senator from the state of South Dakota. And I'm here today as a subject matter expert for the Electronic Payments Coalition. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before your committee today, especially on this particular topic. And Mr. Swanson, it's a pleasure to see you again. Mr. Swanson's going to talk a lot about this bill as well, but I want to make sure we are all on the same page on what's actually on the page in the bill and not talk about some of the political rhetoric we see across the country on this type of issue. It is important to note that this is a very complex piece of legislation, and there are a lot of issues wrapped up in this 5-page bill with a lot of moving parts. I would also like to remind this committee that this bill is not the same bill that you took public testimony on last year and the year before. This is a completely different, it's a similar topic, but this bill does different things. I appreciate the prime sponsor talking about assisting the local merchants and finding a way to drive down costs for businesses. I believe that is the goal of absolutely everybody in this room. Affordability is the goal. This bill does not do that, unfortunately. It will actually make it harder for your merchants and your consumers to access credit and utilize the electronic payment system. Before we get into some of the words on the page, let's talk about the global payment network and how vast and complicated it is. The electronic payment system was 100% built by the private sector. Think about your credit card. Think about the size. Think about where the strip is. Think about where the chip is. Think about all of those parts and pieces that actually make the card, and then think about how many parts and pieces and businesses make that work. Standardizations have had to occur between all of the parties across the globe so everybody can use their credit card or their debit card. The electronic payment system is open to nearly all financial institutions globally. Doesn't matter if you're big or small. More than 90% of the American population participate in the electronic payment system with a 93% satisfaction rating. This industry is highly competitive, to offer the fast and safe and secure services while offering technological innovations to help prevent against fraud and abuse. In addition to the technological competition in this industry, there's competitive contract pricing for processing of all of these electronic transactions. To give you just a quick snapshot of how many players we're talking about across the globe, we're talking about 12,000 financial institutions, your banks, your financial institutions, and everybody else. There are over 40 major processors, and there are 9 networks globally that must balance all of the contractual relationships between the financial institutions and these networks, and the networks are then balancing contractual relationships between the merchants. Millions of merchants are using the system today. And finally, hundreds of millions of us across the globe are using our credit and debit cards. I want to remind you, all of these participants in the global payment network system need to work together in order to ensure that your financial data is safe and secure. Passing this legislation will place Pennsylvania on an island and out of sync with the electronic payment system that the rest of the world uses. I appreciate the willingness of the prime sponsor to bring forward this legislation and to have this conversation. However, this bill is fundamentally flawed on a variety of reasons, and we don't have time to delve into it, and you've seen some written testimony. But just to name just a quick few, this bill forbids networks from charging a fee for their services on the sales tax portion of a transaction. It is important to note, how will the networks know what the sales tax actually is? The merchants are the only players in this entire payment system that knows what you, the consumer, purchase, whether it's taxable or not taxable. Only the merchant knows what data is transmitted over the lines. Financial institutions and networks have no idea what you purchase and how much of that was taxable or not taxable. Think about the different types of tax rates you have in your state and what's taxable and not taxable. Food is taxed differently than alcohol and other beverages and guns and you name it, baby formula. Everything's different. This bill does not assist networks from knowing that. This bill forbids networks from standard default contractual relationships if merchants do process sales tax as part of what they buy. In practice, what will this do? Networks have no idea what the consumers are purchasing and what the merchants are running through the payment system to get paid. There are a lot of companies that are out there. There's a lot of compliance related to sales tax, sales and use tax. As you all know, your sales tax laws are complicated. Networks are not in that business. Your merchants do that for your state. You have vendor compensation to help your merchants facilitate that relationship with the state. What happens if networks back away from the merchants who are running sales tax on the system because of compliance risk with the fines and penalties in this bill? The merchants are going to be left trying to negotiate contracts with 12,000 different financial institutions worldwide to get the credit cards and debit cards working. Large retailers have armies of accountants and attorneys to figure all of this out. But what about your local food truck? Your local food truck is going to be stuck trying to figure out why his customer's credit card or debit card does not work. He's going to be, you have to, instead of having your food truck figure out what the best product for your customers are, he's going to be stuck trying to figure out working with financial institutions to make sure that he can accept payments or go cash only. Customers are going to be, across Pennsylvania, are going to be frustrated because they will no longer be assured that their credit card or debit card will work with all merchants. The food truck owner will have to call each bank across the globe and set up their own payment contracts for the cards issued by these financial institutions. I don't know about you, but I don't know when the last time the food truck guy called the Deutsche Bank in Germany in order to make sure the tourism industry has a way to make payments. And finally, and I apologize for being so long-winded, but it is a very complicated bill with a multifaceted. But finally, this bill regulates when networks charge fees on chargebacks. It is very important for you to note that if you have a true fraudulent transaction and your credit card is stolen and somebody racks up financial charges, true fraudulent transactions have zero fees charged to the customers or to the merchants. Merchants are held harmless, the consumers are held harmless. Your financial institutions will take the brunt of the fraud risk for the unsecured credit for the transaction. Another piece is chargebacks are already explicitly regulated under the federal government. This legislation is attempting to regulate something that is already regulated at the federal level with Regulation Z, and the debit cards have another regulation as well. These are two regulations, and this bill and the federal regulations are not mutually exclusive. So in closing, and I covered a lot of information very, very quickly, and the written testimony covers even more in depth. But the Electronic Payments Coalition wants to make sure that we're helpful throughout this process. We appreciate the prime sponsor, we appreciate the conversation, but I'd like you to remember that your financial institution, your merchants, and your constituents are our customers as well. Affordability is top of mind, and we want the system to work. We want to make sure everybody in this system is successful. But I do not believe a state-by-state patchwork of laws is the governing payment systems is the correct approach. And with that, I'll stand by for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters, and we thank you for your oral testimony, but also the written testimony that was provided to the committee previously. I'm now going to call on Dan Swanson. I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll have questions right after the second testifier. I'd like to call on Dan Swanson, consultant for the Merchants Payments Coalition. And I'd like to note for the record that Representative Scott is present.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee, for having me here today. It is green. Can you hear me?
I think I'm closer.
Can you hear me now? Great. Thanks again for having me. Again, my name's Dan Swanson. I'm an attorney. I represent the Merchants Payments Coalition. I also worked for nearly 20 years for U.S. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who was the author of debit swipe fee reform that passed in Congress in 2010. I also worked for a long time on credit card swipe fee reform. And I'm here because the status quo is not sustainable when it comes to the swipe fee system. And that's why there's a large and growing coalition of businesses, labor unions, consumer groups that are calling for reform. And even President Trump recently called the current system an out-of-control swipe fee ripoff. You've got about 2/3 of retail payments today that are made by debit and credit card, and that percentage is growing as the use of cash is declining. Visa and MasterCard control about 85% of the debit and credit card network markets. They have set up a system of fees and rules that stifle normal marketplace competition. So every time a Visa or MasterCard card is used, several fees are deducted from the transaction amount as the money passes from the cardholder's bank to the merchant's bank. The network takes a fee for itself, the card issuing bank deducts a fee, the merchant's processor deducts a fee. So a merchant ends up only getting about 97 or 96 cents for every dollar that is paid by card after the fees are deducted. Now, the biggest fee is the interchange fee. These are fees that the card issuing bank, so if you have a Visa card that's issued by Chase or Bank of America, it's the card issuing bank deducts the interchange fee from the card transaction. But these fees are different from pretty much any other type of fee that you'll see in the financial services industry. With late fees, annual fees, interest rates, every bank sets its own fee rate in a competitive market environment. If you don't like the rate you're getting from a bank, you can go to the bank down the street and get a different rate. But Visa and MasterCard fix interchange fee rates on behalf of the thousands of financial institutions that issue their credit cards. So the banks don't have to compete with each other over the fees that they deduct. So Visa and MasterCard publish fee schedules. Here's MasterCard's. Complex categories of different transaction types with different fee amounts listed. And all the banks that issue MasterCard use this fee schedule. They're all getting the same fee rate. They're not competing with each other over the rates that they get. Visa has a similar fee schedule. These fee schedules are a sweetheart deal for banks because competition usually holds fees down, but interchange fees keep going up. Now they're often 3% or more of the transaction amount. Now there is a cost to processing card transactions, but because of the way these fees are centrally fixed by Visa and MasterCard on behalf of thousands of banks, interchange fees far exceed the cost. And most retailers have single-digit profit margins. So 3 to 4% swipe fees force retailers basically to raise the retail prices of their goods to cover the cost of the deducted fees. And we see now every American family on average pays about $1,200 a year in higher retail prices just as a result of these fees. The fees basically fuel inflation. So the question is, how do you try to ensure that these fees stay at a reasonable level if the market doesn't serve to perform that function? Countries around the world have stepped in to regulate the fees that Visa and MasterCard set. And in the U.S., we have some debit card fee regulation at the federal level. But there is no regulation of credit card swipe fees in the U.S. Overall, there was $187 billion total collected in swipe fees in 2024. $111 billion of that was just on Visa and MasterCard credit card fees. Now, compared to some of the reforms that we've seen around the world, like fee caps, the proposals in HB 2090 are relatively modest, but they are important. The first, the bill would say when card networks, Visa and MasterCard, are establishing their interchange fee schedules, if they use percentage-based fee rates, like 3% of the transaction, which they do, that most of these rates are percentage-based, they have to make sure the transaction amount doesn't include sales taxes. Sales taxes are money that the merchant is required to collect on behalf of the state. Merchants don't keep that money, but they are assessed interchange fees on that money that they collect on the state's behalf. It's not reasonable to charge merchants a fee for collecting a required tax. So the bill would tell card networks the burden's on them. They have to end swipe fees on sales taxes. And under the bill, there are a lot of options for how networks can comply with that requirement. They could stop charging fees that are percentage-based. They could adjust their fee rates so they're not percentage-based fees, and then the bill would no longer apply to them. They could change their fee formulas so that the taxes are excluded from the transaction amount before the percentage is applied, if the merchant has that information ready at the time of transaction. They could provide rebates to merchants promptly after each transaction. They could allow merchants to compile sales tax data for batches of transactions and provide that to the network so they could get a credit for the fees that were paid on batches. Visa and MasterCard could stop having a system where fees are deducted from the transaction amount at the time of transaction and just have merchants pay these fees on a regular billing cycle afterwards, so there's no question about what tax is owed. It would all be done after the fact. Or you could have Visa and MasterCard stop fixing fees on behalf of banks and just have a system where banks set their own fee rates in a competitive market environment. These fee schedules are kind of an anachronism. I understand the need or the desire to have them back in the 1970s when these networks were getting built up, but that was 50 years ago. Visa and MasterCard are a dominant duopoly now that controls the way that Americans transact money. We don't need to have this fee-fixing cartel structure that they have where banks are basically guaranteed a certain amount of revenue, no matter how efficient or inefficient they are at running a card business, no matter how much or how little fraud they get. They're guaranteed the same fees as every other bank in the network. That doesn't have to be that way. So the technology is there for this bill to work, for the sales tax to be excluded from the amount that the percentage-based fee is applied to under these fee schedules. And importantly, states are not preempted from federal law when it comes to regulating non-bank payment card networks like Visa and MasterCard. I'm sure there may be some questions about the litigation that's been going on about this, but that's where it stands now in this Illinois litigation. There are a couple other provisions in the bill. I'll just briefly mention them. Senator Peters talked about the chargeback fees, and the bill would say that if Visa and MasterCard are going to impose fees related to a disputed transaction, there just has to be a finding of responsibility for the person who's being assessed the fee before the fee is assessed, and the person has to have notice of that. Right now, Visa and MasterCard charge fees if someone wants to have this transaction reviewed. So a consumer has said, we dispute this transaction, we think there was fraud happening. The merchant's bank loses the money, the card issuing bank takes the money back, claws it back, and if the merchant says, I want to have someone take a look at this, there is a fee charged for them to have the right to have that transaction reviewed. So we're saying you can't do that. You can impose fees after there's been a finding of responsibility, but not before. You can't basically deter merchants from ever trying to have these things reviewed by assessing fees, which may end up being bigger than the disputed amount. The other provision relates to Visa and MasterCard's rules that regulate how merchants can offer or advertise discounts or surcharges. There are extensive rules, and Visa and MasterCard will penalize merchants who offer or advertise discounts in ways that Visa and MasterCard don't like. The bill would say as long as the merchants are complying with federal and state law, they can't be penalized by the card network. And then last, under the bill, the enforcement mechanism is by the Attorney General of the state. They're the only ones who can bring enforcement actions. And importantly, the only ones who enforcement actions can be brought against are the payment card networks. There would be no enforcement actions brought against banks or credit unions. Again, the payment card networks are the ones setting the fee schedules that all the banks follow. So if you have the payment card networks fix their fee schedules, all the banks and credit unions are following what they're doing. So passing these reforms would provide meaningful relief for restaurants, grocery stores, retailers, folks on Main Street across the Commonwealth. Pennsylvania merchants paid over $312 million in swipe fees on sales taxes in 2023, and that money would be better off kept in Pennsylvania communities. Now, I've worked on swipe fee reform for a long time. I know that the banks and credit card companies have opposed every legislative proposal that's been put forward at the federal or state level that would change the status quo. They have just argued that the status quo works fine and that we don't need to change it. My view is you can't have a system where Visa and MasterCard get to fix fee rates on behalf of all the banks without market competition, without regulation to keep the fees in check, or they'll take too much. And that's why this bill would provide meaningful relief for folks in the Commonwealth. So I urge the committee to move HB 2094. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson, for your testimony and also your written testimony, which has been distributed to the committee. I do want to note for the record that Representative Gatos is present and Representative Waxman is present. We're going to now open it up to questions from committee members. I appreciate Representative Gallagher, the prime sponsor, speaking on this earlier. I'm one of the co-primes, and Representative Greg Scott is as well. I would just like to say that I believe this bill would benefit merchants and consumers, and we're talking about the sales tax portion of a transaction. There are swipe fees on the entire transaction, but this is an issue where the swipe fee is also charged on the sales tax. Now, the sales tax is something the merchants are required to collect by the state of Pennsylvania and other states, but we're talking about just Pennsylvania, and transmit to the state government. And with that swipe fee of 3% coming out of that, the merchant is still required to turn over the entire amount of the sales tax to the state. So they end up either eating that as part of their cost or passing it on to the consumers. When we talked about this issue a year and a half ago, many times it was just the consumer, just the merchant paying it. Now, in many cases, the consumer's paying it directly. Either when you go to the bagel shop or a pizza shop and they have a convenience fee, or a credit card fee. They will be charging the consumer directly the 3%. One last week was 4%. Being passed on to the consumer. But even if it's not passed on in that way, I realize that the cost is one of the things that merchant has to struggle with a slim profit margin. They're trying to hold down costs for competition, but they have rising costs on the front end. So they're in a tight spot, and it leads to higher costs for the consumers. I do want to note the comment that President Trump made. He was talking about the Credit Card Competition Act. It's Senator Roger Marshall, a Republican out of Kansas, and Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat out of Illinois. That's the context where he talked about the swipe fee ripoff. I think it was a social media about a month ago. So I believe that if we're talking about $187 billion in swipe fees nationwide, that's from federal data, and possibly as much as $10 billion of that is just for the sales tax portion. The estimate that you just said, about $312 million for average Pennsylvanians. Pennsylvania's paying $312 million. If we can eliminate that extra cost on the merchants and the consumers, I believe that we'd be saving the citizens over $300 million. I'd like to call on Representative Scott for comments and questions, and then any other member of the committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our testifiers today. I'd like to thank my colleague, Representative Gallagher, for bringing forth this legislation. A couple things, two perspectives. Last night I left the Capitol, went to fill up my gas tank to put gas in my car. Then I went into the little shop to grab some food. I didn't know in Harrisburg some of the gas stations sell some really good fried chicken, and I wanted the fried chicken. When I went to go check out, the merchant had on the glass window behind in front of the bulletproof glass that if I wanted to use my credit card and this transaction was under $10, I would have to pay a $3.50 fee on top of the thing. So I had to either make a decision to go against my doctor and my wife and get a couple more pieces of chicken, or do I pay that extra $3.50? And I'm not going to tell what I ultimately did, but this is what consumers are facing every day because of these increase in these swipe fees. I'll tell another little story. So I once owned a pizza shop, one of my entrepreneurial pursuits. I could tell you that it didn't go as successfully because I'm here in the legislature now, but one of the costs that was burdening me as a pizza shop owner was some of these increase in these fees and the credit card swipe fees. And when I went to go negotiate with the merchant vendor who took care of my swipe, I was met with, I have to email them. I was able to get the sales rep to give me the actual transaction device, but after I got the device, I had to, any type of support, I had to email. There was nobody I could talk to. There was nobody I could negotiate with respect to my rates. And so those are just two perspectives of how everyday business people and everyday consumers are interacting with these swipe fees. The last thing I'll say is this. Well, actually, I have two more points. But one of the things I'll say is that there are other states that are considering eliminating all the tax fees, swipe fees rather. This bill is not doing that. This bill is literally saying just for the sales tax. And I know, Mr. Swanson, I think you illuminated that in your comments. You read the bill. You're a lot more intelligent on this thing than I. But is that what you read too when you saw this bill?
That's right. It would just cover the sales tax portion of the transaction. The rest of the transaction would not be affected by the bill.
So if I went and I bought a soda for $1, we're talking about the 6 cents that we are paying for the sales tax. That's the only thing that this swipe fee is covering. You can't give a swipe fee on that 6 cents of the $1. Is that correct?
That's correct. But as you mentioned, those pennies add up. $312 million paid in the Commonwealth on those sales tax swipe fees in 2023.
Got it. The last thing I'll say, Mr. Chairman, is this. This is we are an official legislative hearing, but I am up for re-election, as with all of my colleagues right now. And I've got some really damning material that went out on social media from this Twitter, or X, from @RealDonaldTrump. And it said, everyone should support great Republican Senator Roger Marshall's Credit Card Competition Act in order to stop out the control of swipe fee ripoffs. Roger is a fantastic senator, President DGT. And unfortunately, some of my constituents have shared this and compared my legislation to President Donald Trump. So I'm in danger of coming back next time because I'm in agreement with President Donald Trump. I would urge all my colleagues to support President Trump on this particular issue and vote in favor of this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Scott. I'd now like to call on Representative Dallas Kephart.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Swanson, I have a question for you. You started going over this a little bit whenever you were speaking about this Illinois federal district case. I have it with me here. And, you know, they actually granted a preliminary injunction, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with how that works, but for the people in the room, one of the criteria that you have to do that is you have to have likelihood of success on the merits. Usually they go ahead and carry those through whenever they do a permanent injunction, and then also another one is you had to have irreparable harm. So the way I read this on, I don't know what it was, page 18 or so, but I mean, Illinois basically had the same thing it said about on the sales tax portion, the gratuity, just that part, not the whole swipe fee transaction, but then on page of the good judge's opinion here, she said that basically this is preempted under the National Banking Act and the Barnett Bank Standard. So now my question is, so it just applied to federal banks and so forth, but a lot of banks in this Commonwealth are federal banks, I would say. Is it your understanding that, you know, this is going to be, I mean, and again, it hasn't been decided here in Pennsylvania, it wouldn't be ripe yet. If this is just going to be applied to federal banks and they would issue the same opinion here, then would only state banks have to, you know, deal with this?
Yeah, so the difference with the Illinois law that was passed in 2024, it did apply to the sales tax portion of the transactions, but the enforcement mechanism there was that enforcement actions could be brought against basically any participant in the payment system. You could sue the card issuing banks, you could sue the merchants banks, you could bring enforcement actions against the processors, the payment card networks, or any other entity that was involved in that. And so after the law was passed, financial trade associations brought suit saying, no, you are preempted by federal banking laws from bringing enforcement actions against the entities that are regulated under federal law. And there were some preliminary decisions at the preliminary injunction stage by the judge saying, it's an assessment of what's likely to come at the merit stage, but she said, yeah, you would likely see that there's preemption of nationally chartered banks under federal banking law, and some out-of-state chartered banks. Said you would likely not see preemption for credit unions or in-state banks. But the most important piece of what she said at the preliminary stage was you don't have federal regulation of the payment card networks. Visa and MasterCard are not financial institutions. They are not regulated like banks are at the federal level. So she said she didn't see there being any preemption. Again, this is the preliminary stage. We'll get a merits ruling at some point. She didn't see there being any preemption for state efforts to regulate and enforce against Visa and MasterCard, the payment card networks. So HB 2090 follows that guidance and targets the enforcement on the payment card networks, which is where the action should be, because Visa and MasterCard are setting the fees and rules on behalf of all the banks. They're the ones who decide what the fee rates look like. If you tell Visa and MasterCard to change their fee schedules, everybody does it. There's not a single bank or credit union out there who doesn't follow these fee schedules. But the Illinois law, basically, the guidance that the judge has given so far is what you see reflected in this bill, and that's the best way that you can do it at this point.
Mr. Chair, if I could also.
Deb Peters.
Thank you. I appreciate, Mr. Chair. So while I appreciate how the bill was written, the fundamental mechanics of how the actual electronic payment system works is regulated by this. And so just for those of you who can see, I have 3 pieces of candy sitting here. We have the networks in the middle. And I would like to just demonstrate, because we are talking about a very complex, lots of transactions, and I can show you lots of pictures of all of the pieces and parts. But let's simplify how this actually works and why going after just networks or just financial institutions when we're talking about the global payment network is very, it breaks the system. It throws it up on end, and you guys are going to end up on an island without stuff working. And here's why. Here's your payment network. They're in the network. Your networks and your payment processors are the middleman. They're the people that move money. They move money from one point to the next point. The middleman has contractual relationships, absolutely, competitive contractual relationships. The middleman has to balance the difference and the relationships between all of your financial institutions. The folks that issue the cards, the folks that are advertising online and getting you to get into the credit cards and the debit cards. The payment processors and the networks are negotiating with the financial institutions on fee schedules to ensure that they have mutually beneficial items. But it's not that simple, is it? Now you've got the merchant. The merchant is the one that is also a part of this transaction with the middleman, working in collaboration with your payment networks and your processors. And now we have facilitators too, and we again, due to time and complexities, it's more complicated with what Representative Scott had talked about. So you've got your merchant negotiating contractual relationships with your networks and your processors. So you've got your banks and your merchants on opposite ends, and you have your payment networks and processors in the middle with contractual relationships with both parties. It is a balancing act to ensure that all parties are happy. If the networks upset the banks go away and find another payment network or a different processing unit. If the merchants disagree, they can move and change as well. So I just want to make sure that we're clear, while this bill does go after the payment networks, the networks are not the ones that know what is moving on their network. They know one number. They know the amount of the transaction. They do not know the parts and pieces. This bill penalizes networks if they charge a fee on something they do not know. This bill does not address or hold accountable that the information submitted to the networks is actually accurate to ensure that they are in compliance with this law. Because of that, networks are not going to process transactions that include sales tax, because there's nothing holding anybody accountable to ensure that what money is transferred on the network does not include sales tax. There's no accountability to ensure that the data on the network does not include sales tax if a fee is charged. There's just no way to do it at this time.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have.
I'm happy to, if the chairman would like.
We have about 5 more questions.
Happy to go how you like.
So I have Representative Fritz, then Representative Kutz, Harris, and Gatos, and then Chair Greiner. Representative Fritz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So shame on me, I'm not familiar with all of my colleagues' bios and past life. Rep. Scott, thanks for sharing that. But there's occasion where I can call from my background, and for 15 years prior to serving in the state legislature, I was a principal and operations manager for a very successful dealership. And I think that I can use that background and that experience to offer a sound assessment. And my assessment on this legislation is this: it is a solution looking for a problem. This is an additional headache and cost for business owners. And I really hang my hat on 3 items to oppose this legislation, and I'll keep it short. Number 1, 20 other states have rejected. I think that's a very sound sample size as well. And my colleague Rep. Kephart referenced this. It's currently being litigated in Illinois. And lastly, it does not speak to online sales or returns. So there are some real reasons for consternation on this legislation. I think it's complex and it's being rushed through. And for that, I'm going to be a sound no. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Fritz. Representative Tom Kutz.
Thank you, Chairman. I will be brief as well. Just want to emphasize a couple of points. Number one, Mr. Swanson, in your testimony stated that you believe that $312 million would be better used in the community, but this bill doesn't actually do anything to say that those fees go back to consumers. I don't know about you, but I don't think you're going to see merchants go and lower their prices here. If they want to pass something off to the consumer, they're already doing it. I mean, we saw ridiculousness on your restaurant bills when they would add a 2021 surcharge because of COVID. And so if businesses want to add those fees, they're going to add them. They're not going to pass these off to the consumer. So the notion that $312 million is going back into the pockets of consumers is ridiculous. And then to say it's not reasonable to have fees on paying taxes, it costs businesses. The cost of doing business includes the cost to pay your taxes. It costs me to prepare my taxes as an individual. I have to pay a CPA to be able to do that. When you open a business, you understand that you're going to have to pay a certain amount of fees as the cost of doing business. So what you're proposing is actually, in this case, going to be harmful to smaller financial institutions like community banks and credit unions, who actually are ones who finance the community projects that we want. What you're talking about is giving big retailers breaks on their fees and penalizing smaller financial institutions who are the ones actually funding small businesses. So this bill actually harms small businesses. And any notion that we're going to help small businesses by passing this bill is ludicrous. And I think I will note to this that over 20 states have rejected this, including states with Democratic trifectas in their legislatures. So if we're looking around the country as looking for a reason to say no to a bad piece of legislation, look no further than that not only is this likely to be struck down in federal court, but that 20 states, red and blue alike, have also soundly rejected this as bad policy. So, you can have talking points on whatever side you think here, but I think the facts are pretty clear, and that's that this is a flawed piece of legislation. I respect the sponsor of the bill and his efforts here. However, for those very sound reasons, I urge a no vote from all of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Kutz. Representative Keith Harris.
Good morning. Good morning. I want to thank my colleagues for introducing this legislation. Listen, I want to congratulate you on your, being a state senator. I'm pretty sure you did a lot of good work being a state senator. I come from a marginalized community, so it's diverse. So a lot of people on SNAP benefits. And, this mass hysteria with this corporatocracy, that's why states are building stadiums now. Same thing, mass hysteria. If you don't help us build a stadium, we're going to move to another state. That's how we got into that. It's a multi-trillion-dollar business, the sports industry, right? And now with the credit card fees, I can see now why I'm in a grocery store. There's a lot of grocery stores in some of my areas in my district. And some of the children or even adults, they may ask for a quarter or 50 cents because they can't, because the transaction fee is really creating insufficient funds on an EBT card, on SNAP benefits. Right now, we talking about now. I got a American Express. I'm a little fancy now, right? So I got these things. Or I got a bank card, debit card. They'll give me a overcharge, right? I'll get that, $35, right? So, but it's not such as with the marginalized community, So they can't get a box of cereal and some milk because they have insufficient funds just because of the fee. Right, so I do think that Representative Gallagher and Scott and Chairman Samuelson and the rest of my colleagues have an interesting point to raise some of these fees in, because it's a bit challenging for some constituents and Jane and John Doe public in general. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Harris. Representative Val Gatos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my colleagues, Representative Kutz, did a pretty good job in just talking about how this really affects small businesses. But Deb, she addressed how complicated it is. I was a small business owner, and in the early days of taking credit cards, it was huge. And I was one of the first entrepreneurs in the 90s to get it on the internet. So there was the gateways, and then there was the middleman, and it's a lot more complicated than people understand that it is. So while I would agree that credit card swipe fees are exorbitant, there's no doubt about it, and we all hate to pay them, but simply eliminating it on sales tax is a mockery of the whole problem. And so when you look at the complication of how the credit card swipe fees occur, it creates a bigger problem. And as I've always said, is that more government is never the answer to bad government. And when I look at the taxes, if I want to be really simplistic about it, maybe I see the problem is that we're paying too much taxes. So my question is for the panel there, can you walk through, and maybe I was a little late coming to the committee here, having been at another committee meeting, but what is that process for an entrepreneur, a small business, to be able to handle this and move this sales tax, which they still have to pay, the charge on that, to move it off that credit card? You did address that they can return it to the customer. How else do they pay? I mean, what other systems do they have to have? I mean, to me, as having been a small business, it seems like it's just one more thing that a business has to endure for a very small amount of money for that business that they ultimately have to give the government, and it creates a nightmare. So could you walk through some of those options?
No, I'm happy to speak to that, Representative, and it's in my written testimony as well, laying out the different ways that networks can comply with this requirement not to assess interchange fees on the sales tax piece. So it only applies if they're using percentage-based fee formulas, 3% of the transaction. The bill says you can't have a percentage-based fee formula, takes a percentage of the transaction amount, unless it excludes the sales tax from the transaction amount. So if they were to change their fee formulas, first of all, and say, okay, we're not going to do percentage-based anymore, they'd be compliant. If they were to say, okay, if the merchant has at the time of the transaction the sales tax amount and transmits that as part of the transaction data, then you can subtract it from the transaction amount before you apply the fee and when they deduct the fee as the money passes between the banks. That would be a way you could comply. You could also do it after the transaction, either individually, if the merchant provides the tax data, or they could do batches. They could send to the network, here's the sales taxes that we were assessed. And merchants have this, it's on the receipt. You know, they keep track of this, but they could send batches to the networks and say, we'd like a credit for these interchange fees that were assessed on our sales tax portion of the transaction. You could also change the way that it works right now where these fees are deducted at the time of the transaction. Banks want the float, so they're taking the money out at the time of the transaction rather than billing the merchants at the end of the month for the fees that they're being charged. You could change that. You could have this be done on a monthly cycle. There'd be no dispute then about what fees are owed. It would be every month that's gathered up. So there's a lot of different ways that the networks could change their behavior to make sure that they're in compliance with this. At the end of the day, we understand that they don't want to do that. They like the way that it works right now, but it's not sustainable for small businesses. And again, as others have mentioned, this is not as sweeping reform as you could have. Like in Europe, they don't have 3% transaction rates. They have 0.3% because they cap them for credit cards in Europe. Things work fine in Europe. You don't need this much money to run a system. But this bill just takes a piece of the problem, the portion that applies to the sales taxes, and would rein that in. Not the whole problem, doesn't fix everything, but it does take $312 million per year out of the Commonwealth, and it would be helpful to both consumers, because these fees are passed on in the form of higher prices, and the extent to which consumers benefit depends on the competitiveness of the retail sector. Gas and groceries are the most competitive. That's where you're likely to see most savings. But if that money stayed with the businesses and the small businesses, that would mean more employment, more in reinvestment in the businesses here, as opposed to the money going to Wells Fargo and Bank of America.
Thank you, Dan Swanson. Deb Peters.
Thank you, and I'll get to the fundamental crux of your question.
I mean, it sounds like a nightmare. It sounds like a nightmare for small businesses that may not have a whole lot of transactions in volume. It may be okay for a business that has volume, but for a smaller business, this sounds like an absolute nightmare. I mean, I commend you for addressing the issue of outrageous credit card swipe fees. There's no doubt that has to be addressed in some way. But by doing it in such a piecemeal way, it's almost creating more problems before we fix the problem.
Yep.
So, feel free to expand.
And Mr. Chairman, I would love to address this question for you as well, and you're absolutely dead on accurate. The larger retailers are going to have the skills
volume.
and the tools necessary in order to reprogram their software, in order to do all of the complicated changes that we're talking about here. But your local small food trucks, your local C-stores, your local convenience stores, the smaller grocery stores, you're talking about fundamental software changes that would have to require, and merchants are not going to want to take the risk of transmitting money with sales tax as being a part of that, because this bill does not, it punishes the networks for the risk of not complying, and the networks are not going to take the risk. So unless the merchants can figure out a way in order to ensure that the data that's transmitted and the money that's transmitted is not, I don't know how we do that at this time. I mean, there's a lot of complexity.
So they would be required to have additional software. What is the typical cost of these software, the point of sale?
Honestly, it really depends on the market, on what type of facilitator for the small merchant. Every merchant with different needs. Your restaurants have a Toast type software when you go to the restaurants, and so they have different facilitator fees plus network fees, and so they're going to have to retool it. It would be up to them to figure out what those costs are going to be, and your C-stores are going to have a different software with different upgrades. This isn't something that can happen in 60 days, according to this piece of legislation. Every retailer in the state is gonna have to make a change of some magnitude. The folks on the ground, the local small mom and pop shops, are gonna have the hardest time complying with this to ensure that they are in compliance with networks that are trying to be in compliance with this piece of legislation. It's just not a workable solution at this time.
Thank you. I would absolutely agree. And again, we have to address all these credit card fees that might be exorbitant, but doing it this piecemeal sounds like it'll be an absolute disaster for our small business, and that's not something I can support.
Thank you. A couple more questions. We have Representative Cepeda Freitas.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm scratching my head. So I'm a former small business owner, a restaurant for 19 years, and unfortunately recently had to close. And you're right, Representative Gatos, like these transactions, these fees are a nightmare. However, I have some concerns, right? So for example, Senator Peters, you mentioned that this legislation is going after networks, right? Whereas I'm thinking, well, where are the opportunities for small business owners to have some type of financial relief and savings? Second, Mr. Swanson, you said the technology is there. So what is the problem? And I say this because as a small restaurant owner, I had a Clover device, a point of sale system. And I paid $50 a month to a software that would take the 6% sales tax, put it to the side, and file for me every month and send the payment. So it relieved me from that responsibility. Another thing I want to say as a small business owner working my business, shopping around for processing to compare prices, I couldn't. So I settled and had to suck up the cost. So I support this bill because I am in support of finding ways that we can provide any financial relief to our small business community, because it's really tough out there and it's gotten progressively worse in terms of cost of everything rising. So to sustain a business is getting more challenging. So question is about how does it hurt small business? Because I know the technology is there. Like, I've used technology. There's technology, it's forever changing. And then second, how does it hurt the small business? And also the next question is, why does it fall on the merchant to figure this out and not on the processor?
Give an opportunity to Deb Peters, then Dan Swanson. Deb Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your question. First, you had a lot of questions in there, and I appreciate it. As a small business owner, you don't have the technology available to you today in order to do this. You will have to upgrade your software and your hardware in order to comply with this type of legislation, adding additional costs. That's how you will have to be compliant as a small business owner. And the reason why you would have to do this is the current system today does not delineate or transmit the data necessary in order to be in compliance with this law. if this bill passes. So as a small retailer, as a small restaurant, when you transmit that information over Clover, that is part of your swipe, the money transmits over, they know, but Clover isn't your payment processor. That's somebody else, right? The payment processor doesn't know the separation between what was food and beverage or the relationship, because you guys tax alcohol at a higher rate than your prepared food or your grocery food, right? So Clover knows all of that. They are your processor of sales tax, which is a very complicated thing, but they're not your network. Your networks only know one number. They only know what the amount of the purchase. The current system today only transmit one number. They transmit your location, they transmit the merchant data information, your customer name, so the banks can know who the card is, or the card number, not even the name, I apologize. But the only information your network knows is the one number. There's no differentiation between the two at this time. So this whole network would have to change that. Or the simple solution, because of the quick turnaround of this piece of legislation, networks are going to mandate merchants only process the food and beverage and the taxes separately. But the taxes will not be allowed to be on the network, because the network can't verify the data that it includes or excludes sales tax. So if you are a small retailer and you are trying to be in compliance with this, and your software hasn't yet upgraded in the 60 days required by this piece of legislation, you are then, because your network isn't going to know the difference between tax or non-tax, you are going to have to assure the network that only the food and beverage is going as the restaurant through the network, but your sales tax is going to have to be paid separately, because the networks are not going to figure that out yet. The software isn't there. The data that's transmitted over the network for the network is only one number, remember. So it's just adding a lot of complexity to a larger global network. And at this time, it sounds simple-ish from Mr. Swanson's perspective, but at this time, your networks do not have the financial data required in order to comply with this law at this time.
Thank you, Deb Peters. We'll go to Dan Swanson. Then I have one more question from Representative Rossi, and then closing comments from Chair Griner and myself. Dan Swanson.
Just in response to your question, so Senator Peters' comment assumes that the only way to comply under this bill is at the time of the transaction for the sales tax information to be transmitted throughout the system at the time of the transaction. And for many transactions, it is. It's called Level 2 data. The sales tax is sent along with the transaction information, but for not all merchants. But the bill has multiple options for how you can comply here. And you can do this through rebates and credits. Merchants do keep track of how much sales tax they're collecting. They have to remit it. You've got that information there. Under the bill, it is an option for that to be provided individually or in batches to the network and get rebates or credits assessed. So it's not a situation where everybody has to have that information. There are some merchants who don't have computers. Their record keeping may not be as up to speed as others, but they can use the rebate option in order to have that money sent back to them. Overall, with the bill, the burden is put on the networks here to make sure they aren't assessing interchange fees on sales taxes. There are a lot of ways they can get there, but the burden's on them. And if they're doing it, then they will have to face civil penalties or injunctive relief brought by the Attorney General. But it's not a situation where the burden is on the merchant to figure out how to get the information there at the exact time, or else the merchant loses out. That's not how the bill's structured.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. I misspoke. There's two more committee members, Representative Rossi and then Representative Webster, and then we'll go to closing comments. Representative Rossi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm dealing with a restaurant right now that's having massive computer issues with their credit cards, and they just lost $15,000. The restaurant owner called me frantically crying, trying to get this cleared up, and new equipment sent out 3 times. The software won't work. Just dealing with her, we could not even reach them to get the software working or figure it out. So I'm really concerned about this and the mass chaos it will cause, because I've spent a week on just phone calls and trying to reach people. How could you What would you describe they would do with this change for all the restaurants and all the small businesses that 15,000 is a big hit? What's happening is her customers are leaving and then it's declining and kicking back and they're already out the door. So I'm worried about that, like with all the changes on the credit card software.
Sure. I mean, the first change that would happen if the bill were to become law is the fee schedules that Visa and MasterCard make would have to change. And we did this before at the federal level in 2010. There was a change that says if Visa and MasterCard are going to fix debit interchange fee rates on behalf of big banks, then those fees have to be limited and capped. Once that went into effect, MasterCard and Visa came up with a different page on their fee schedules, which says for those transactions, here's how the rates are going to work. If we had, this law passed tomorrow and say that you have to exclude the sales tax amount before you apply the percentage, you'd have a page on the fee schedule which would say that. And then, again, there's multiple ways that the network can make sure that it's not breaking the law and not charging those fees on the sales taxes. At the time of the transaction, they can subtract the sales tax amount before the fee is applied. You can do it that way. Or they can tell the merchant, okay, batch your information up, send it to us, and then we'll get you a rebate for any fees that were assessed on the sales tax portion of your transactions. Or they could just get rid of the percentage-based fees and charge a flat fee, which would be a lot simpler for everyone involved because, frankly, percentage-based fees are inflationary. When you're charging a percentage for the fee amount for the transaction fee and inflation is causing prices to go up, you're getting more in fees every time inflation happens. So there's a lot of ways that this could change. I understand, I've worked on this for a long time, that the status quo is appealing to a lot of folks because it's very lucrative, but it's not sustainable for the merchants. And frankly, the consumers at the end of the day bear the costs, and that's who we're trying to fix it for.
Okay,
Thank you, Deb Peters.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and I apologize for your constituent having so many issues with processing. I'm a retailer as well, and I know exactly what you're going through. When we're talking about the payment process and how money is moving, it is a complicated scenario, and it's important to note who's got the handle of what data, what's available for that data. It's important to note that when your customers are experiencing issues, they should be trying to communicate from a variety of different folks. Sometimes they have payment facilitators, sometimes it's the network, sometimes it's the financial institution, and it all depends on the type of trouble that they're having. But it's important to note that when you are a consumer and you are swiping that card, and this doesn't probably go directly to what your issue is, but I want to kind of walk us all back and put us back into, because it's complicated, let's talk simple, right? When you go and you charge on your credit card or your debit card, when you get your bank statement or your credit card statement, it is the whole amount of the transaction and you received something for that transaction. It's important that if it's a credit card, that the financial institution that helped you process that transaction, let's say you have a Chase card or a PNC card or an American Express card, whatever utilization or financial institution you utilize to process that transaction, they know the one number that charged you the total amount, right? They took on the unsecured credit risk to send out the money so you could purchase that item. They took the risk. That's why there's fees affiliated between, remember, your bank, your networks, and your merchants. There's a reason those fees exist, because somebody's taking an unsecured risk. There's no guarantee you're going to pay your credit card statement. There's risk involved there. There's risk with chargebacks. There's risk with fraud, which are, by the way, two separate things. It's important to note that your financial institutions are on the hook 100% for unsecured credit when doing credit cards. Banks don't know the difference between that of what was purchased and how much was taxes. The banks don't know that. They know the unsecured credit that they lent out was 100% of the transaction. This bill, yes, there are ways and mechanisms around it, but there's nothing that mandates that the networks know what's on there. The merchants are the ones that are your sales tax collectors. That is accurate. Your sales tax laws are very complicated. There's a lot of things you tax, and there's a lot of things you don't tax, and there's a lot of varying rates of that tax. That is not the banking environment. today we're talking about in House Bill 2090 is talking about banking and networks. And even though the focus is sales tax and not charging a fee on a tax, keep in mind as a merchant, how many expenses do you have aren't actually your expenses anyway. You have to pass things on. There's a lot of variety here. Sales tax is just one other thing. Unfortunately, that's the cost of doing business because you are the collector and the remitter for the state. You're doing the state's business, which is why you allow surcharging and those types of things. You have vendor compensation to help your retailers and your merchants collect and remit. There's other avenues in order to offset these increasing costs. Now, keep in mind, your interchange fees have not increased in 10 years. 10 years, the interchange fees. Now, if you're seeing an increase, it's because you're either increasing the growth of your sales or your facilitator, which is a whole nother type of a conversation, which is providing additional services and fees on top of you just providing the money movement service. So there's a lot of things that are happening, and this particular piece of bill is just patchwork and doesn't work. And unfortunately, not to be melodramatic, but if this can't work, and you guys have just put a monkey wrench in the entire global payment network because of the tight turnaround, because of the compliance issues, because of the complexity for your small retailers, you're going to end up with a card chaos situation, and your constituents are not going to know whether your card is going to work or not until you've actually already pumped the fuel or you've already eaten at that restaurant. So I would just highly encourage you to know more about how the payment network process works and all of the fees and all of the money moving services that are available, as well as all of the facilitators and all of the services that are increasing on top of that, not just your credit card network fees that we're talking about.
Thank you, Deb Peters. I have one last question from Representative Webster.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really just a comment, and we'll be careful how I say this because I don't want to oversimplify too many things. We've had a lot of discussion today from our members about experience, background, and credentials. So I'll go down that path just briefly. My team in the Air Force years ago put high-profile, high-definition maps on a personal computer 5 years before Google did, right? And so I'm saying that simply to say I can spell IT. I then spent 10 years in the IT management consultant world with Accenture, a global 500 company, and I would recommend for all of those who are voting on these bills to understand the statement. The argument that's being presented against this bill basically says, because we're not doing it that way right now, we can't possibly do it. And I would tell you the technological issue is pedantic. It's very simple. In the IT world, even with artificial intelligence, these transactions can change, and it's not that complicated to do that in the big sense of information technologies. So I would say let's not get stuck on the technology side. And last, I have this is more on the value structure and the perspective of the world. That we're being told we can't do it because we don't do it that way right now, and we're being told that there's a global financial system and it's unassailable, so don't even try. And I think we ought to be really careful. If you believe in all the capital economic theories and the power of Pennsylvania's people and resources, right? This is a big economic budget in Pennsylvania, and banking transaction systems will adjust to make sure that consumers in Pennsylvania can spend whatever that number is. If it's $53 billion in just our own state budget, imagine the power of economics in Pennsylvania. We can do these things because transactions will matter and banks will want to do business in Pennsylvania. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Webster. I'd like to have Representative Keith Greiner, Chair from Lancaster County.
Thank you. Yeah, I know a lot of questions I thought Representative Kutz did a great job explaining the whole process. Since we're going to talk about resumes, I am the only CPA out of 253 in the legislature. I'm the only one. I'm the only one that can sign CPA. So I'm very concerned about fraud, very concerned about structure of transactions. I will say that. It's kind of interesting. Last year when this bill came up, I was like Roger Marshall. I talked to the credit card industry. I said the reality is, and we have small business owner here, and they testified that maybe there needs to be a discussion about the cost of swipe fees. I said that. Obviously, it's kind of funny. The president quotes. There's somewhat of a parallel. It's like reading the Bible here, though. I will say too. President Trump made a comment about the swipe fees, but if you actually look at the context that he was writing that about, he had a bug up his rear end about Bitcoin. And I'm just making a comment that kind of got spun off. His comments here kind of got spun off. But the reality is, I did talk to the industry last year just about swipe fees in general. I do think, this is me, I do think the solution needs to be at the federal level. I'm not going to be upfront. I am disappointed at this bill. So we're taking one little piece, and I work with small business, and to try to break it out, I do think there's going to be additional costs to small business with this. I understand my colleague, Representative Webster, about, how things change and technology and everything, and eventually we can probably get there, but there's a cost to that. And so I just have concerns about the bill. I have to laugh at Representative Scott. We aren't mixing apples with apples here with what Trump said in this bill. I mean, they're two totally different things in my mind. One's comprehensive macro, looking at the whole system to try to come up with a solution. This one's just the incremental one, and I do think it's a problem. I used to say, I used to tell people there's two things in life that are super complex. One is tax law, and the second is milk pricing. Let me add a third, swipe fees, because really, by the way, I thought you both did an excellent job. You're both, passionate, both knowledgeable. I do have a question. You said hi to him when you walked in. How many times does this happen?
Ironically, I have known Mr. Swanson since he worked in the Durbin office, and
we worked together on some things.
And we've worked together on a few issues.
Can I tell you what does bother me? No states have passed this legislation.
One.
Which one?
Illinois.
Which is probably going to. Which, let's be honest, the court case looks like it's going down for you guys.
Again, we'll see what happens on the merit stage, but we actually think the most important decision that came out of that preliminary stage was states can regulate card networks because they are not banks.
And it was state, was it federal, not state? I get confused too with all, it's overwhelming. I do think though, because of the nature of the complexity of this, and I think there's a lot of questions, and we're only talking about the sales tax piece. I am worried small business or restaurants in particular, I think they're going to find out there's additional cost to this. I think it needs to be more thoroughly vetted. I mean, I will say, I understand the president's comments. I understand Roger Marshall's comments. I'm the one that actually brought up to some people last year, why are we looking at this portion? Let's just look at comprehensive reform. Let's try to help our small business overall. That's how I look at things as a CPA. Let's talk about real reform and not look around the edges. And I don't think real reform can be done at the state level. I think something has to be done at the federal level to move forward. And that's why I'm a no on this. I just don't think it's ready. I think that, like I said, it's extremely complex, and if I get glossed over, I probably should be more humble. But if I get glossed over, listen to this. I can't believe everybody else here didn't get glossed over. Listen to the financial, the financial aspects of this.
Thank you.
Just making a comment.
Thank you, Chair Greiner.
Can I give you the statistics? 26 bills have failed last year alone, and Virginia was the first state this year to kill this particular legislation.
Thank you, Chair Greiner. I would point out there have been bills that have been voted in the positive in Illinois, and a couple that have been voted down, but others have been introduced and not brought up. If a bill is introduced and not considered, that's not that it was rejected. It was not proactively rejected. It just did not come up. But the Illinois bill actually became law. I just want to speak. I have one more bill after this, so I want to speak in closing. I realize, yes, I agree with Chair Greiner. I would love it if we could have a federal solution and Congress would vote yes on the Marshall-Durbin Bipartisan Credit Card Competition Act. Republican out of Kansas, a Democrat out of Illinois, that would address this on a national level. I don't know if the credit card companies would favor that bill, but that would be a good national solution. In the meantime, states like Pennsylvania can take action on the sales tax portion. Just think of it. Think of this. When you have a $100 transaction and we have a 6% sales tax, it costs the consumer $106. Yes, the credit card companies and the financial institutions are going to charge a swipe fee on the $100, maybe about $3, about 3%. But they're also charging a swipe fee, an upcharge, if you will, on the tax. Why should consumers pay an upcharge if you're paying a tax? Look at it from the merchant's perspective. The merchant has to collect the tax, pay the swipe fee, and turn the full amount of the tax over to the state. The merchant has to come up and make up the difference when the large out-of-state network is collecting the money. So I know the national solution would be something that we all would favor, but in the meantime, a state like Pennsylvania can save consumers money, it can save the merchants money, and I know when I'm talking about that $100 transaction, on that particular transaction, the swipe fee on the sales tax might be about 18 cents, but there are millions and millions of transactions, and we've heard today that collectively, the merchants and the consumers of Pennsylvania are paying $312 million. Let's save our merchants and consumers $312 million. I urge a yes vote. I want to call for a vote on this bill, and then we have one more bill to consider in the next 10 minutes. If I could ask our senior committee legislative assistant to call the roll. Lori Smith.
Chairman Samuelson.
Yes.
Abney.
Yes by designation.
Sapita Freites.
Yes by designation.
Tina Davis.
Yes by designation.
Fleming.
Yes by designation.
Gallagher. Gungauer.
Yes by designation.
Harris.
Yes by designation.
Krajewski.
Yes by designation.
Rabb.
Yes by designation.
Scott.
Yes by designation.
Vincent.
Yes by designation.
Waxman. Webster. Chairman Greiner.
No.
Fritz. I'm sorry, DeVanzo.
No by designation.
Fritz. No. Gatos. Jones.
No by designation.
Kephart. Kutz.
No.
Mako.
No by designation.
Rossi.
No.
Rinkavich.
No by designation.
Stamba.
No by designation.
Stender.
House Bill 2090 is reported from the Finance Committee by a vote of 14 yes and 12 no. We have one other item on the agenda, and I have Representative Mirsky present. We had a public hearing on House Bill 788 last week. And I'd like to call up House Bill 788, printer's number 809. I'll ask our committee, committee executive director, Mark Foreman, to give a description of the bill.
This bill would reduce the mutual thrift and institutions tax.
And I'd like to allow Representative Mirsky for a 1-minute statement. I appreciate your testimony last week.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had the opportunity to offer more comprehensive remarks last week on this legislation at the committee's public hearing, so I'll just say a few words today. House Bill 788 that I've co-primed with Chair Greiner is an important bill with bipartisan support that would bring the mutual thrift institutions tax in line with the corporate net income tax rate over the next several years. Mutual banks are community-based financial institutions that are owned by their depositors, not by shareholders. They deliver financial services in parts of the Commonwealth that frequently lack major commercial banking options, and they play a vital role in many local economies. I respectfully ask my colleagues for an affirmative vote on House Bill 788. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Mirsky. Thank you for this opportunity to bring some financial relief to our community banks all across Pennsylvania. Thank you, Chair Greiner, the co-prime sponsor of this legislation, and thank you for your remarks last week at our hearing as well. I do have an amendment, and so the chair would like to call up Representative Samuelson's amendment, A2389, and will the committee agree to the amendment? So I'd like to ask Mark Foreman for a description of the amendment.
Amendment 02389 would remove the thereafter language in existing law to avoid conflict with the MTIT reduction. It would begin the reduction in the year 2026, and it would increase the net operating loss carryover from 3 years to 6 years.
Thank you. I'd just like to say when this bill was written last year, it reduced the tax over 9 years from 11.5% to 4.99 in 9 steps. The first step was in 2025. We're already in 2026, so we're just going to, the amendment jumps ahead to year 2, reduces the tax rate to 8.55 for this year, and then continues with that reduction schedule until it's all the way down to 4.99 in the year 2033. Also changes the NOL provision to 6 years. The current law is 3 years. I'd like to ask Chair Greiner for remarks on the amendment.
I want to just say we're almost at 11 o'clock. I just want to approve the amendment.
Okay. Are there any negative votes on Amendment 02389? The amendment passes unanimously. On the bill as amended, thank you, Representative Mirsky. Are there any negative votes or discussion? Are there any negative votes on House Bill 788 as amendment?
None on my side.
No negative votes. House Bill 788 as amended passes the House Finance Committee unanimously. With no further business, this meeting is adjourned.